Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about thesis statements. So your thesis statement is the most important sentence in your entire essay. And the reason it's so important is because it tells your reader what you're going to prove to them. It's your argument. Your thesis statement outlines the plan and the purpose of your essay. Without it, your essay's organization is much harder to follow, and the argument or overall point is harder for your audience to understand. So a thesis statement usually goes at the end of an introduction, but not always. Most of the time, a thesis statement is one sentence, but it can be divided into two sentences if your idea is really complex or if you want to add your body paragraph topics to the thesis. Now remember that the purpose of an introduction paragraph is to get your reader interested in reading your overall essay. And to give them the background information that they need to understand it. It gives your reader context they need to understand the deeper analysis that you'll get into later. Once you've written a good introduction, now it's time to add a clear thesis statement, and because you've created a roadmap so that readers can follow your writing more easily. Now, I hope that each of you will develop your own personal style of thesis statement writing, but there are some general things that are helpful to keep in mind so that your thesis statement is effective. 1, make sure that you present a clear argument. Your thesis statement should be an argument that can be proved or disproved. It should not be a statement of commonly held fact. So avoid things like this first one in red. In J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye, the author shows a boy who wanders around New York for 3 days after being expelled from his school. This kind of sentence is not arguable since there is no analysis and it is literally what happens in the story. It doesn't present an opinion that you can prove in your essay. Instead, try something like the second one. In J.D. Salinger's novel, The Catcher in the Rye, the author shows that individuals struggle to make meaningful connections with others in a world that makes people feel isolated from each other. This thesis statement is arguable. I can use the text to prove that this is Salinger's opinion, his theme. Number 2, make sure your thesis addresses the prompt fully. If you are answering a question prompt, your thesis statement should be the answer to the question. If you are writing a critical commentary analysis, your thesis should identify the idea or ideas the author presents and the technique that is used to create the message, which is the purpose of a commentary. So let's take a look at an example. For my essay on The Catcher in the Rye, my teacher has asked me to answer this prompt. Discuss the ways in which the writer of the work in your study, so the author of The Catcher in the Rye, has sought to make their portrayal of characters and or situations convincing. So my thesis statement should directly respond to this prompt. I might say something like this. In his novel, The Catcher in the Rye, Salinger makes his characters convincing, particularly focusing on his main character, Holden, by demonstrating his confusion, his loneliness, and his desire to form meaningful emotional connections. This thesis statement directly answers the prompt, and it is closely tied to it with language using key words from it. Number 3, organization. One of the biggest things you need to do is make sure your sentence is clear and organized. This means that it should use active voice and not passive voice. In this book, it is shown that people struggle with loneliness. This is a bad thesis statement because who is showing that people struggle with loneliness? It's really vague and imprecise and indirect. A better thesis statement uses active voice. In this book, the author demonstrates that people struggle with loneliness. A thesis should have direct language and get rid of unnecessary information. A bad thesis statement is long and overly complicated and confusing, like this one. The idea of relationships is in the book, and Holden wants to find positive relationships so he can be happy. This connection with others is hard to find, and he has a hard time finding it, so he is lonely. A better thesis statement gets right to the point, like this one. In the book, the main character struggles to make meaningful connections with others, which adds on to his loneliness. Some teachers' prompts or essay guidelines will ask you to include an indication of the body paragraph topics you will use in your essay to prove your topics. Others will not. Now, often that's a style choice and one that you need to figure out for yourself. I personally like to write them, and I like to see them in student essays since it acts as a clear indicator of how the essay will be organized and how the point will be proved. So here's a thesis statement that does not indicate the body paragraph topics. In his novel, The Catcher in the Rye, Salinger emphasizes the struggle against loneliness that individuals experience. And here is a thesis statement that does indicate the body paragraph topics. In his novel, The Catcher in the Rye, Salinger emphasizes the struggle against loneliness that individuals experience, particularly through his characterization of Holden, the isolated setting, and the stream of consciousness narrative voice. Now, notice that this sentence sounds like a list when it is read out loud, with commas separating each item and making it sound like a list. If you are going to offer your body paragraph topics in the thesis statement, make sure that the order that you say them in is the same order they appear in your essay. It confuses readers if your organization doesn't match the organization in the thesis statement. One last note. In literary analysis essays, it is always a good idea to relate your argument to something that matters. If your prompt asks you how writers make their characters convincing, consider why it matters if characters are convincing or not, and think about referencing that in your thesis. It adds a nice element of so what to the whole thing, and it gives your analysis greater weight since it's connected to something that quote-unquote matters. This so what factor can also be accomplished in the introduction or conclusion, but I recommend you have it in a thesis statement as well. So let's take a look at the thesis statement I wrote before this prompt. This prompt is discuss the ways in which the writer of your work has sought to make their portrayal of characters and or situation convincing. So my original thesis is, in his novel The Catcher in the Rye, Salinger makes his characters convincing, particularly focusing on his main character Holden, by demonstrating his confusion, his loneliness, and his desire to form meaningful and emotional connections. Okay, so that's my original thesis statement, but now I want to add that kind of so what factor. It answers the prompt. This original one answers the prompt, but it's kind of boring. I don't know why I should care about whether or not characters are convincing. So let's add to it. In his novel, The Catcher in the Rye, Salinger makes his main character Holden convincing to the readers by demonstrating his confusion, his loneliness, and his desire to form meaningful emotional connections, therefore allowing readers to connect and empathize with a character who is going through the universal struggle of adolescence. By adding this last section, I have indicated to my reader the effect of the author's style choice, and it reminds them of the purpose of it. It helps readers to understand why it matters if characters are convincing or not. Now, the revised thesis statement works, but it can feel a little bit overly long and clunky. You could also break it up into two sentences. In his novel, The Catcher in the Rye, Salinger makes his main character Holden convincing to the reader by demonstrating his confusion, his loneliness, and his desire to form meaningful emotional connections. This allows readers to connect and empathize with the character who's going through the universal struggle of adolescence. Now, I hope this helps clear up any confusion about what thesis statements should look like and how they should be structured. Remember, if you have any questions or need any additional help, you can always ask your teacher. Thanks for watching.